January 17th, 1944. Somewhere over the frost-etched fields of occupied France. The morning sun barely crests the horizon when Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller feels it, a vibration through his cockpit, subtle as a heartbeat, but wrong. He banks his Messerschmitt Bf 109 east toward Abbeville, scanning the cloud layer below. The sky belongs to the Luftwaffe here. It has for 4 years. The contrails write German supremacy across every dawn. Müller's gloved hand rests easy on the throttle. Below, the patchwork farmland of Picardy lies frozen and silent, a conquered mosaic stitched together by occupation. He has flown this route 63 times. He knows the rhythm of these skies, the lazy arc of reconnaissance, the occasional scattered flak from partisans too brave or too foolish to hide. But this morning, something fractures that rhythm. A glint, twin glints, silver, not gray, moving fast. Müller keys his radio. His voice is calm, trained. Unidentified aircraft bearing 270. The response crackles back, static-laced and uncertain. Then he sees them fully. 2 fighters, twin-boomed, closing with a speed that defies reason. They do not maneuver like Spitfires. They do not climb like Thunderbolts. They simply come, twin engines howling, cutting through the January cold like scissors through silk. Müller's hand tightens. For the first time in 4 years of air superiority, he does not own this sky. The P-38 Lightning had arrived in France. To understand the terror that unfolded over France in the winter months of 1944, one must first understand what the Luftwaffe believed itself to be. Since the Blitzkrieg of 1940, German fighter pilots had been the gods of the European theater. They flew with the confidence of conquerors, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs decorated with kill markings that told stories of Spitfires shattered over the Channel, of Soviet Yaks spiraling into the steppes, of American fortresses trailing smoke toward the earth. The Third Reich's propaganda machine fed this supremacy into every newsreel, every radio broadcast. Luftwaffe aces like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders were household names, their faces plastered on posters from Berlin to Bordeaux. To be a German fighter pilot was to be invincible. The sky was not contested, it was owned. But by late 1943, cracks had begun to show. The American 8th Air Force was bleeding over Germany, yes, but it kept coming. B-17s and B-24s, wave after wave, their formations tight, their gunners trained. The Luftwaffe shot them down by the dozens, yet the bombers returned, and with them came the escorts. First, the P-47 Thunderbolts, brutish and effective but limited in range. Then the P-51 Mustangs, sleek and deadly, capable of reaching Berlin itself. But before the Mustang became legend, another fighter had already begun hunting German pilots over France, and it was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever faced. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was born from a 1937 U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of speeds exceeding 360 miles per hour. What emerged from Lockheed's Berlank plant was a machine that looked ripped from science fiction. Twin Allison V-1710 engines mounted on elongated booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot, and an unprecedented concentration of firepower. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon, all nose-mounted, all firing along a single converging axis. No wing-mounted guns meant no need to calibrate for convergence. When a P-38 pilot squeezed the trigger, destruction followed a straight, unforgiving line. German intelligence officers first encountered the reports of the Lightning in North Africa, where it harassed Rommel's supply lines and tore apart U-52 transports over the Mediterranean. The Luftwaffe called it Der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. The name was not affection, it was warning. But North Africa was distant, a sideshow. France was the heartland of occupation, the jewel of the Reich's western conquests. Surely the Lightning could not dominate here, not against veteran pilots flying from fortified bases, not against the concentrated might of Jagdgeschwadron squadrons that had ruled these skies since the fall of Paris. They were wrong.
The P-38's deployment to the European theater of operations began in earnest in the autumn of 1943, with the 55th Fighter Group and the 20th Fighter Group leading the charge. These units arrived not as green recruits, but as hunters, their pilots trained in the vast skies of the American Southwest, their machines tested and refined through months of combat in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters. The Lightning was no longer experimental, it was proven, and it was hungry. What the Luftwaffe encountered over France was not merely a fast aircraft, it was a predator engineered for a specific kind of warfare, energy fighting at altitude, boom and zoom tactics that exploited the P-38's twin-engine power and devastating armament. German pilots had grown accustomed to turning fights, to the close-quarters knife work that rewarded experience and instinct. The Bf-109 could outturn most Allied fighters, the FW-190 could outroll them, but the P-38 did not turn, it did not roll. It climbed, it dove, it struck, and it vanished into the clouds before the Luftwaffe could react. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins of the 55th Fighter Group later described the P-38's advantage in clinical terms. We could see them from 20 miles out. We could choose our engagement. We could dictate altitude, speed, and angle of attack. And once we committed, they had maybe 3 seconds to react. Most didn't. The statistics bore this out. By February 1944, the 55th and 20th Fighter Groups had claimed over 200 German aircraft destroyed, with loss rates that stunned even Allied command. The hunters had become the hunted. But numbers alone cannot capture what it meant to be a Luftwaffe pilot in those months. To understand that, one must return to the cockpit, to men like Oberlieutenant Müller, who had believed the sky was his birthright. Müller does not see the P-38 that kills him. He sees its shadow first, a flicker across his canopy, twin boom silhouette impossibly close. He pulls hard left, yanking the stick into his gut, but the Lightning is already above him, already diving. The nose flashes, not the sporadic chatter of wing-mounted guns, but a concentrated eruption, a single column of fire that walks across his right wing and into his fuselage. The Bf-109 shudders, metal tears, hydraulic fluid sprays across the inside of his canopy, hot and slick. Müller's radio is screaming, voices overlapping, panicked, none of them his own. He tries to level out, but the controls are dead. The horizon tilts. The fields of Picardy rush upward. There is no time to pray, no time to curse, no time to wonder how this happened. There is only gravity and fire and the sudden, absolute understanding that the sky no longer belongs to him. His wingman, Feldwebel Otto Kessler, watches Müller's 109 spiral into the frozen earth and explode in a plume of black smoke. Kessler does not stay to observe. He dives for the deck, pushing his throttle to emergency power, weaving through the treetops at speeds that would have earned him a reprimand in peacetime. The P-38 does not follow. It does not need to. It has already climbed back to altitude, rejoining its flight, scanning for the next target. Kessler lands at Abbeville 17 minutes later, his fuel gauge kissing empty, his hands shaking so badly he cannot unbuckle his harness. He sits in the cockpit for 5 minutes, staring at nothing. When the ground crew finally helps him out, he does not speak. He walks to the debriefing room, writes his report in silence, and requests a transfer to the Eastern Front. His request is denied. There are no safe skies left. Stories like Müller's and Kessler's proliferated through the winter of 1944. Luftwaffe squadrons stationed in France began to avoid engagement with P-38s unless they possessed overwhelming numerical advantage, and even then losses mounted. The twin-boom silhouette became a harbinger of death. German pilots who once climbed to meet any challenge now scanned the sky with dread, knowing that altitude belonged to the Americans, that speed belonged to the Americans, that the initiative, the tempo, the very geometry of combat had shifted beyond their control. The Luftwaffe had expected to face adversaries. They had not expected to face this, an industrial philosophy made airborne, a fighter that embodied not just tactical superiority, but the sheer material abundance of a nation that could afford to build machines with twin engines, twin booms, and firepower concentrated enough to obliterate a target in a single pass. Every P-38 that appeared over France carried with it an unspoken message: we can afford to hunt you. You cannot afford to fight us. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, understood this shift before most. In February 1944, he issued a tactical directive acknowledging what could no longer be denied. Engagement with P-38 formations should be avoided unless conditions overwhelmingly favor our forces. The Lightning's altitude advantage and concentrated firepower make it the most dangerous opponent currently operating over the Reich's western territories. The directive was classified, distributed only to squadron commanders, but its implications rippled through every Luftwaffe base from Brittany to the Low Countries. The gods of the air were in retreat.
But the P-38's dominance was not solely technological, it was psychological. German pilots had been trained to believe in their superiority, not just as aviators, but as representatives of a regime that proclaimed itself the apex of civilization. To be hunted, to be outmatched, to watch comrades fall to an enemy who struck with impunity and vanished before retaliation was possible, this eroded something deeper than morale. It eroded the myth. The Luftwaffe had been the visible arm of blitzkrieg, the steel-winged proof of German invincibility. When the P-38s came, they shattered that proof, one engagement at a time, one pilot at a time, until the skies over France belonged not to the Reich, but to the distant hum of Allison engines and the glint of twin booms catching the sun. The symbolic weight of this shift cannot be overstated. For the occupied populations of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the sight of P-38s overhead was deliverance incarnate. They did not see aircraft specifications or tactical doctrines. They saw liberation written in contrails, the promise that the Nazis' grip was loosening, that the balance of power had fundamentally changed. Resistance networks passed along sightings, marking the days when lightnings appeared, tracking their presence as one might track the phases of the moon, predictable, inevitable, a natural force reasserting itself against tyranny. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe's losses over France had become unsustainable. Entire squadrons were rotated out, their survivors hollow-eyed and quiet, their replacement pilots younger and less experienced with each passing week. The veteran aces who had terrorized Allied bombers in 1940 were dead, captured, or grounded by wounds. Those who remained faced an enemy that did not relent, did not exhaust, and did not stop coming. The P-38 flights increased in frequency and size. Where once a German patrol might encounter a pair of Lightnings, now they faced flights of 8, 12, 16, entire squadrons sweeping the skies clean, escorting bombers to their targets and then hunting on the return leg, fuel tanks still half full, ammunition bins still loaded. The American pilots who flew these missions were not supermen. They were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from California, ordinary men trained to extraordinary proficiency by a nation that had industrialized warfare itself. They flew because they were ordered to, because they were paid to, because they believed in a cause larger than themselves. But they also flew because they were good at it, and because the P-38 gave them the tools to translate skill into results. First Lieutenant Robin Olds of the 494th Fighter Group, who would later become a legend in his own right, described the sensation of flying the Lightning as absolute confidence made manifest. You didn't hope to win, you expected to. The airplane demanded it.
That confidence was infectious. It spread through the fighter groups, through the bomber crews they escorted, through the ground personnel who maintained the aircraft, and the intelligence officers who tracked their kills. It became a feedback loop of success, each mission reinforcing the belief that the Luftwaffe could be beaten, that air superiority was not a distant dream, but a present reality, that the road to Berlin was open, and the only question was how fast the Allies chose to travel it. The symbolic heart of the P-38's dominance, the object that recurred in letters home and debriefing reports, was not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It was the twin boom itself, that unmistakable silhouette that German pilots learned to fear and Allied soldiers learned to love. The boom was not merely structural, it was declarative. It announced, "We are here, we are different, we are inevitable." In a war defined by incremental advantages and brutal attrition, the P-38's design was a statement of abundance. 2 engines where one might suffice, space for more fuel, more guns, more pilot protection. It was American industrial might distilled into aluminum and steel, a machine that did not apologize for its excess, because excess, in the hands of democracy, was a virtue. French civilians who witnessed P-38s in action described them in terms that bordered on the mythic. Marie Dubois, a schoolteacher from Amiens, recorded in her diary on February 9, 1944, "They came low over the rooftops today, 2 of them, silver as knives. The sound alone made the Germans scatter. We stood in the street and watched them climb, watched them disappear into the clouds, and for the first time in 4 years I believed we would be free." Her words were not unique. Across occupied Europe, the P-38 became a symbol not just of Allied air power, but of Allied certainty. The certainty that defeat was impossible when backed by the resources of a continent that could produce machines like this by the thousands. And produce them they did. By D-Day in June 1944, over 1,200 P-38s were operational in the European theater, their presence so ubiquitous that Luftwaffe pilots stopped reporting individual encounters and began noting them collectively as lightning activity moderate to heavy in daily logs. The skies over France, once the exclusive domain of the Messerschmitt and the Focke-Wulf, had become contested, then hostile, and finally untenable for the Reich's Air Force.
The transformation was complete by the time Allied ground forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, the skies above the invasion fleet were clear of German aircraft. Not because the Luftwaffe had been destroyed, though its losses were catastrophic, but because it had been driven back, pushed beyond the range where it could effectively contest Allied air superiority. The P-38s and their Mustang and Thunderbolt brethren flew top cover over the landing zones, their presence so dominant that German ground commanders reported no observable enemy air activity could be challenged. The fork-tailed devils had not merely won air superiority, they had annihilated the very concept of German air resistance over the invasion beaches. But the cost of this victory, measured not in American losses, which were remarkably light, but in German psychological collapse, was profound. Luftwaffe pilots who survived the pre-invasion months carried with them a defeated mindset that no amount of ideological fervor could reverse. They had been trained to see themselves as warriors of a superior creed, flying machines of superior design. The P-38 stripped both illusions bare. It revealed the Luftwaffe for what it had become, an air force outmatched in technology, outproduced in industry, and outlasted in will. The men who flew against the lightning learned that courage without resources is only martyrdom, and martyrdom without hope is simply waste. Oberlieutenant Heinz Knoke, one of the few German aces to survive the war, wrote in his memoir, "We fought with everything we had. We fought with skill and with fury. But in the end, we fought with fear, because the Americans did not care how many of us they lost. They would replace them."
And we knew, each time we climbed into our cockpits, that we could not be replaced, that we were the last of something already dead. His words capture the bitter calculus that the Luftwaffe and its sister aircraft forced upon the Germans. Not a fight between warriors, but between philosophies, one that hoarded its strength and one that spent it freely, knowing more would always come.
The epilogue of the P-38's war over France is written not in the ledgers of kills and losses, though those are stark enough, but in the quiet moments that followed liberation. When American forces rolled through the villages of Normandy and Picardy, they were met not just with flowers and wine, but with stories. Stories of silver planes that tore through the sky, that challenged the occupiers, that proved the Nazis were not invincible. Children who had grown up under the swastika drew pictures of twin-boomed fighters. Resistance members who had risked execution to aid downed pilots spoke of the Lightning as though it were a living thing, a guardian angel with engines and guns. The P-38 flew its last combat missions in Europe in April 1945, by which point the Luftwaffe was a spent force, its pilots grounded by lack of fuel and lack of hope. The Lightning had not won the war alone, no single weapon ever does, but it had broken a myth, and in breaking that myth, it had hastened the collapse of a regime that depended on illusions of supremacy. The skies that German pilots once owned now belonged to no one and everyone, contested and free, patrolled by machines that embodied not conquest but guardianship. There is a photograph taken in May 1945 of a P-38 Lightning parked in a field near Reims. Its fuselage is scarred with flak damage, its paint faded by sun and rain. Beside it stands its pilot, a young lieutenant from Nebraska, 23 years old, exhausted, alive. In the background, French children play, their laughter carried on a wind no longer broken by air raid sirens. The pilot does not smile for the camera. He does not need to. The twin booms behind him say everything that needs saying, that freedom is not given, but taken, that abundance is not excess, but strength, and that the skies, once stolen, can be reclaimed by those willing to fight for them. The Germans thought they owned the skies. They built their Reich on that belief, painted it in propaganda, and flew it as doctrine. But ownership is an illusion when faced with something greater, not just superior technology or industrial might, but a philosophy that refuses to accept domination as permanent. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and its unforgiving firepower, was the physical embodiment of that refusal. It hunted over France not as an invader, but as a liberator, and in doing so, it wrote a truth into history that no amount of revisionism can erase, that tyrants may seize the sky, but they cannot hold it against those who believe the sky belongs to all. And so the contrails fade, the engines cool, and the fork-tailed devil passes into memory, not as a relic of war, but as a reminder that the hardest battles are fought not just for territory or survival, but for the right to look upward without fear, to see the sky and know that it is, and always will be, free.